Today, there are 2 million descendants of French-Canadian immigrants living in New England. These are our stories. Welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Venez tous jeunes filles et garçons, je vais vous raconter l'histoire de notre immigration ici au USA, de grands aventuriers de pays étrangers.
This is the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast. I am Jesse Martineau. Now, today's episode is going to be a really fun episode. Our guest this week is musician Robert Sylvain. Robert proudly plays the music of Acadians, along with the music from various cultures that influence the Acadians. He has been the lead singer for multiple bands and has performed in Nova Scotia, in France, Quebec, New Brunswick, and actually that last one was live on the CBC, which is very fun. I hope to talk about. He's currently working on a super interesting project called Mémère's Notebook, which I am very excited for him to introduce us to. So Robert, welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy.
Thank you for having me, Jesse. Happy to be here.
Now, Robert, where did you grow up?
I grew up actually in we affectionately call the South. What Mainers call it the South. It's Boston.
Gotcha.
But I hope that your listeners won't hold it against me. My parents were both born and raised in Maine, and so now I live in Portland.
Gotcha. Now, did they speak French? Was that their first language?
My father's first language was French. He didn't start speaking English until he went to public school. And he grew up mostly in Waterville, Maine. He was born in Millinocket.
Sure.
And so, mill towns had a lot of people of French descent, and he was one of them.
Did you have any French in your house growing up at all? Were you exposed to it?
Yeah, but mostly, when I went to visit my Mémère and Pepe
Sure.
in Waterville. My dad would speak French with his parents, but didn't really pass it on to me because, as a lot of your listeners probably know, in his generation, being French and speaking French was a liability. He did his best to assimilate and bring his kids up in an Anglo culture. By the time that I was an adult, I was ready to recapture it,
Sure.
So that's what I've been doing, and this is part of it is doing this project of old Acadian folk songs.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, because I'm kind of the same boat you are. I'm the first generation in my family to not grow up speaking French as well. And so I think a lot of this project is probably trying to answer the question why, as to why that happened to us. But I do want to talk about, because I have to confess that I learned much more recently than I would like to admit, or that I'm proud of, that I learned that Quebec and Acadia are definitely different things in different cultures. I didn't really realize that when I was growing up. What did you know growing up yourself about Acadian culture?
Yeah, that's a good question, because actually my Pepe was Quebecois.
Awesome.
Sylvain is a Quebecois name, and my Mémère was a Thibodeau, so she was Acadienne. They met in the St. John's River Valley, where the Quebecois and the Acadian cultures first started to mix. As far as I was concerned, I think as far as many Franco-Americans are concerned, Acadian and Quebecois culture are synonymous.
Right.
And they certainly have mixed into this sort of Franco-American culture that we hear a lot about.
Sure.
And, originally, of course, you've got the French Canada only referred to Quebec.
Right.
And the Acadians were a people that populated the provinces of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and parts of Maine, but they didn't really have a nation. And so after the deportation of 1755, they're a diaspora, and so without a homeland with borders, I think that the identity was obscured.
Sure.
But for people who had those Acadian roots, the handful of surnames that are important to Acadian heritage, those people knew they were Acadian. But I grew up with a Quebecois surname, so I didn't really realize it until I started learning Longfellow,
Yeah.
Evangeline.
Yeah.
And my dad was like, "That's our people." And
That's awesome.
I had no idea. So it wasn't until I was older that I recognized the distinction.
Sure. No, that's awesome, man. We're definitely gonna get to Mémé's notebook because that I cannot overstate how cool this project is. But I'd like to talk a little bit about your career. Now, when did you start first playing music? When did you decide that you were gonna make some money playing some music? Is what I'm trying to say.
I started, playing piano and guitar at a pretty young age, but I didn't really get into it until after high school when I started a folk band in Boston with another songwriter, and we hired a friend who is a fiddle player, Steve Muse, and so we played original songs. But as we started exploring music together, Steve and I realized, oh, both of us have parents who speak French, and he's an Acadian too. It wasn't until we both ended up in Maine and started seeing this underground Acadian culture all around us that we made that connection to the music. When I heard the music of the heritage, I was entranced because it totally immediately hit me as something that I was connected to.
Sure. No, that's so awesome. So basically, right from the very beginning, when you turned your life to music, you knew it was going to be to this folk music, this Acadian music.
Yeah. Well, I listened to a lot of folky stuff and blues as a young man, but it didn't really hit me in the heart. My father was a singer, but
That's awesome.
He sang like barbershop, and
oh yeah,
he was a choir boy. He sang hymns in French as a young man, but that wasn't like something that resonated with me. It was only after I started digging, and then I inherited this notebook of old Acadian songs from my Mémère, and that's when this project started to take shape.
Yeah, that's cool. Now, for people who may not be super familiar, and I'm absolutely putting myself among them, can you explain to us how Acadian music may be a little bit different than the music that we're traditionally used to hearing from Quebec?
Yeah, for sure. Well, there's definitely a lot of overlaps, and the Acadians, because they're diaspora, had influences from other cultures that they came in contact with, and one of them that is pretty powerful up in the maritime provinces is the Scotch-Irish influence, and they're connected also through history by way of the Bretons.
Sure.
I don't know if you're familiar with Breton music,
Yep.
but they're one of the Celtic nations. That's the people of Brittany, France, who have their own language, their own culture, their own type of music, but it's markedly Celtic. And a lot of the Acadians came through Brittany to the New World, and so picked up that style of music. And so if there's a closest relative with regard to the folk music,
Sure.
I think Acadian and Breton music are very closely related. And they have certain disparate traditions, one being fiddle music, which I think we're all familiar with.
Sure.
And then another is these old ballads. And the lion's share of the ballads in my Mémé's notebook are what folklorists would probably call complaints. In French, it's complaint. It's loosely translated to a lament.
Gotcha.
So these epic broadsides with 6 to 10 verses, usually no chorus, and typically sung a cappella. So it's the kind of thing, that they would sit around, around the fire.
Sure.
And maybe somebody would play a fiddle tune. The matriarch would pull out an old lament and sing it for everybody. And you'll see that too in Irish trad, where every once in a while someone will stand up and everyone will be quiet, and they'll sing some beautiful old ballad. And that's typical in the Acadian tradition as well. left without that love of mine, abandoned and alone for quite some time, just to be with the others in his regiment. Off to the war my lover went away. He left me here alone in abandonment, waiting alone for to count the days. It came to pass that after time was spent, I took myself away to the convent, off to a home for poor orphan souls, reconciled to spend my life languishing.
That's awesome. That's super neat. Now, one thing I have to ask about, because we've talked about it on the show before, and I found it fascinating when I first went back and started discovering the music of Quebec, was the whole idea of the foot percussion. I think that's super. Is that something that happens in Acadian music too?
It is, yeah. It's related to clogging, but they do it in their seat, and I think that's what you're referring to, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the sit, and like in my band Boreal Tordu, with Steve Muse, who I mentioned earlier, plays fiddle and stomps his feet as he's playing fiddle. It's really fun to watch.
That's awesome.
So yeah, there's definitely that, and also percussion instruments like les cuillères, which is just wooden spoons.
Sure. Yeah.
There's definitely some overlap, and then there's also overlap in the Cajun culture, which of course is the same people as the Acadians, but since the Cajuns had different influences vis-a-vis, with the Creoles and the Tex-Mex influence down in Louisiana, their music is very different, but then it echoed back to Acadia during the radio days when, Western swing hit the nation. Acadians started hearing Cajun swing. Of course, they've got the language in common and the heritage in common. So you'll hear a lot of Cajun style stuff echoed back into Acadian music these days.
That's awesome. Now, when I'm, thinking about the music that I'm semi-familiar with from Quebec, one of the things that always pops into my head is the whole idea of the call and response.
Yes.
Is the same kind of deal?
Yep. There's a few Mémé's Notebook songs are call and response, or chanson à répondre is what
exactly
they call them. Yep. And they actually have Boreal Tordu has played a number of those types of songs, but since we used to play mostly in New England, and you'd get this, half of your audience are old timers that grew up with French, and they might know the song.
Sure.
But many of our peers and audience members are English speaking, and so they can't participate. And so with this project, with the call and response songs, what I've done is I'll call in French and then respond with the English translation.
Oh, that's
so
cool.
It turns it into something a little bit different, but it's a fun way to connect English and French parts of the Acadian culture, because that's the way I see it, really. Is that the Acadians in Maine, at least in my generation, are English speaking mostly, and there's no reason to be ashamed of that. We grew up in an English speaking world, and our culture is still alive despite the language barrier. It makes me nervous to talk about this stuff, because I know that there are a lot of people who are purists, in the sense that for many years the culture was tied to the language in such a way that a lot of people came to believe that if we lose the language, then you lose the culture. I just don't think that that's true.
And we're 100% with you. That's a large part of what was behind the starting of this project. In fact,
That's
the whole
great.
idea that we had that Mike and I don't speak French, but that doesn't make us any lesser Franco-Americans.
Absolutely. Yeah.
No, that's what we're about. That's very awesome.
Good for you.
Thank you, sir. Now, one of the things traditions, I should say, that my family grew up with, especially my mom, she remembers them pretty distinctly, was the idea of the soiree. where the family would get together. You take all the furniture, push it to the side. If somebody had an instrument, they brought it. Everybody would sing and drink, and the kids would go, play in the kitchen or something.
Right.
So is that kind of the same deal? You were familiar with this growing up?
Yeah, I am. Although what we would do is the adults would be in the kitchen, and the kids would have to go either outside or upstairs. We'd play tiddlywinks or whatever, and or snowball fights, and the adults would. My mama grew up in a pretty small house, but she had she had a little tiny house where she brought up 7 children. It was a little tiny kitchen, and they would sit down. There weren't any fiddlers in my family. My Steve Muse's family was all full of guitarists and fiddlers, so they would play fiddle tunes. But my family were singers.
That's awesome.
My dad's dad was a singer, and sisters both played piano, but I don't remember them sitting around playing instruments. I remember them sitting around singing songs and playing cards.
Yeah, exactly. That's awesome.
Yeah,
that's very cool.
Yeah.
Now, I'd like to talk about a couple of places. We talked in the intro. You played a ton of super interesting places, but I'd like to talk about a couple of them, if you don't mind. Tell me about the Fête des Acadiens in France. What was that festival? How'd you end up there? Describe it for us. That sounds super neat.
Yeah, it was neat. It was kind of surreal. It wasn't so much of a festival as it was a symposium, and I was invited to represent the Acadian Maniacs, the Acadians awesome. Of Maine. I got there. They had a whole schedule of speakers from different places, including a professor from the University of Moncton and other dignitaries from France and different places. And in between each speaker, I was invited to play a song from Mémère's notebook.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was great. And it was so much fun. And I did my best to represent. But I realized after a little bit that, I don't think they intended it to be this way, but I felt a little bit like John Merrick on display. Like, this is what happens when when the Acadians are not connected with their language. You get this shell of a man who can barely speak French, who is struggling to hold on to his heritage. So I was like and this was maybe almost 15 years ago now. So
you were the cautionary tale, yes.
Yeah, exactly. It was very strange, but very informative, and the people were very sweet to me. But I think they felt sorry for me.
Now, I do also, the one I mentioned in your bio when I was introducing you, the Congrès Mondial, and I don't even know if I'm coming anywhere close to these pronunciations, in New Brunswick, live on the CBC. So tell us about that. That must have been, I would have been absolutely petrified.
That was a pinnacle musical career so far. It was the biggest crowd that I've ever played to. There were well over 10,000 people in the audience, and, huge stage, and playing with some of the Acadian greats, like Zachary Richard was the host. He's one of my heroes, and Lisa LeBlanc, who's a killer New Brunswick Acadian folk artist, and Les Hay Babies. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they are awesome trio from Moncton. So, yeah, it was. And Steve Riley from Louisiana was representing the Cajuns. So it was a huge, spectacular concert, and still available. If you dig around on the CBC, you can watch the whole thing.
Well, we're gonna do some searching then. If we can find it, we'll put the link underneath for this.
I think
in our show notes.
Yeah, I think you can get my website, robertsylvain.com, has links to a YouTube channel where somebody posted that.
Nice.
Our part of that program.
Okay, very cool. Now we have to get to the current project that we've mentioned a whole bunch of times, the Mémère's Notebook project. Maybe big picture, what is the Mémère's Notebook project?
Mémère's notebook is a set of songs that were passed down to me throughout the generations. It was written down by my Mémère, Eliza Thibodeau, and they're all old Acadian folk songs. And of course, all in French, but also all without musical notes or chords or anything like that. So it's just the lyrics. There's about 36 songs in this one notebook that I've got. And when it was passed down to me, I immediately recognized it as a treasure.
That's awesome.
You know, it's full of history and heritage and interesting bits of our culture ingrained in these songs.
Sure.
So the first thing that I did is transcribe them in French, because my Mémère has beautiful handwriting, but she had no formal schooling, so her spelling is a little off, and the
Sure.
French is a little bit different than Parisian French. So there's a lot of idioms and oddities. So that was the first step, and then I started the process of searching for the melodies, and a lot of them may be lost to our generation, but many of them I found in archives in the University of Maine, Fort Kent, thanks to Lisa Ornstein, who was the director of the archives back in the day, and she recognized many of them.
That's awesome.
From field recordings that she had done. And my father and my aunt Trudy recognized one or two, so I was able to put together a few of the songs, directly from my family's recollections. Internet searches,
Sure.
pouring through tomes of old songbooks, and some of them I found in archives in the old world, in Europe. So
That's awesome.
They've survived hundreds of years in different versions. So there are many versions of these songs. A lot of them are, because they're folk songs, they have different versions that might share just a single line. And Mémère would use the first line as the title for most
Sure.
of them, which made it difficult to search through tables of contents.
Right.
Just that you couldn't do that. So really what I had to do was internalize the essence of each song, and I would start to recognize songs just based on the story or the meter or a specific phrase. That was a long road. Been working on this for over 10 years, and then it became apparent that there was another step that had to be taken, which is to translate them into English, which actually wasn't as hard as I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because when I heard that you translated, all that popped into my head is kind of crazy. I once heard a NPR interview with Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones, and he was talking about a conversation he had with the singer-songwriter Warren Zevon.
Yeah.
And I remember Warren Zevon telling Keith Richards that he thought the most important thing about songwriting was what he called vowel movements, vowel with a V, A-E-I-O-U. And putting them, choosing where to put them, and using them at the right place at the right time. And I'm just wondering how you could translate a song, keep the melody, keep the meaning, but knowing that those vowels aren't gonna line up.
Right. Yeah, it's a challenge, for sure. I guess what I found is that since I had already internalized these songs and had been singing them in French for many years, I had an intimate connection to the meaning of the song, so that when it came to translating them to English, it was important to me to keep the meaning and the feel and, honor the original lyric. A lot of those translations came pretty easily. I switched around the rhyming schemes in some cases, and I kept some of the idiomatic, French grammar in order to keep the song sounding French.
Sure.
And I think that people will recognize that when they hear the songs, that they're not typical American folk songs. They definitely are Acadian folk songs, and it has a certain feel and a certain texture that I worked really hard to keep.
That's awesome. That's pretty cool. I would like to ask, if you don't mind, about
Yeah.
Mémère Thibodeau herself,
Yeah.
because this is kind of fun for me. Part of trivia that has never come up in the French Canadian Legacy podcast. I actually have the last 8 names in my family tree, the most recent 8 names in my family tree, tattooed on my left arm.
Oh, cool.
One of them is Thibodeau, as a matter of
Nice.
fact. It is.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so who? Tell us about Mémère Thibodeau. Was she a musician? How would it become that she was the one to write all these down and save them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that actually it's not uncommon for the matriarch of the family in Acadian culture to keep one of these notebooks. It was sort of a something for posterity. I have actually another notebook that her brother kept that has many of the same songs, but so there might be a volume 4.
That's awesome.
One thing at a time.
Sure.
My meme, Eliza Thibodeau, grew up in the St. John's River Valley in Connors, New Brunswick. My Pepe, her husband, Henry Sylvain, lived on the other side of the river in what's now the United States. And as we know, the St. John's River in the winter freezes over. So that's sort of
that's so great.
The rest is history. So, back then I don't think that they paid much attention to the border.
Sure.
But Eliza was one of 12, and Henry was one of 11. So there was her brother married his sister. So there's kind of slim pickings up there. And I'm not surprised that you've got Thibodeau in your roots, because if you go back far enough, I think you'll see that the Acadian family tree is more like a wreath than a tree.
Love that. That's awesome. So where are we with this project now? How many have you recorded? Because this is an enormous process. Because you got this notebook with just lyrics. You got to find the melodies. You got to translate a bunch of them. So where are we now?
Yeah, thanks for asking. The first 12 songs are ready for recording, and I've started a Indiegogo campaign to pre-sell the record and songbook. So I'm going to be producing a two CD set with a dozen songs sung in French, and then the same dozen songs sung in English.
Very cool.
And then also to accompany the CDs, producing a songbook, which will be a spiral-bound notebook with the lyrics in both French and English, the notes and chords for each song, and then also references, little history of each song, because each song has an incredible history of its own as they traveled from Europe through Brittany to Nova Scotia to the St. John's River Valley and down to Maine. It's they're really epic. So it's been an epic project.
Yeah, that's so great. So anybody who purchases, you're not just going to get 2 CDs, which is so cool, but you're going to get a ton of other stuff about these songs, which is, I think that's awesome. Very, very awesome. No, very cool. Now, I did want to catch a quote, because I thought you had a quote that I saw from your website, which I had to write down because I thought it was kind of neat. You said that I'm not interested in heritage preservation for its own sake. Some traditions are simply better off under glass. Instead, I strive to find the vital parts of our music and culture. What was that about? Can you explain that for us? I thought that was really cool.
Thank you. I guess for me, this music wants to be heard because of what we can learn from it, and because it's a part of history, but also it's beautiful music that I think anybody will enjoy. Even just even if you don't speak French, I think that I've found that people respond to the French versions of the song. But when you peel back that other layer and begin to listen to the lyrics, they're just some beautiful sentiments that transcend the generations, and those are the gems that I want to polish and present. I think that music wants an audience. I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm a musician and a performer, and I'm an Acadian. My interest is in the bringing our culture forward, honoring the past by showing how the past connects with our present and our future. So that's what this project is really about.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been an absolute blast. I got to ask if somebody, first of all, Team French Canadian Legacy is absolutely placing an order. But if somebody wants to place an order, where could they go? Where can we send them?
Yeah, but best thing is to just go to my website, robertsylvain.com, and there's a link there to the Indiegogo site, and there's a bunch of other links to ways to help and things to do and fun to be had. I'm going to be doing a bunch of concerts and educational programs as well as part of this whole project. I've started to go around to local high schools, grammar schools, and colleges want to explore this kind of musical heritage project, and it teaches a little bit about history, it teaches a little bit about language, and a little bit about music, and so that's one of the things that I'm committed to bring forward as well, is making it into an educational piece.
Well, Robert, this has been a ton of fun, an absolute blast. The Mémère's Notebooks project, super interesting, also super important. I really hope a bunch of people jump on, because preserving these songs is absolutely amazing goal. I thought that's really, really cool. So thank you so much for joining us, Robert.
Thank you, Jesse. Appreciate it. It was great talking with you.
Would you, if I say I love you, would you love me? Quand tu reposes dessus ces roses, des mille choses te doivent rêver. When you sleep in roses deep, 1,000 dreams will come your way. Montez suprême, c'est à moi-même que dis je t'aime de tout m'aimer. Que dis je t'aime de tout m'aimer. Would you, I say I love you, would you love me?
Now our fathers look at us and sigh with despair, to think that everything they love we simply do not share. But the spirit never dies, our culture will survive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive.
Special thanks to Josie Vachon for providing the music. You can find more about her at josievachon.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Mike Campbell. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at fclpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at FCL Podcast for more information about the topics discussed. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to this episode.